The morning Nora Callahan buried her husband, the cattle were already lowing at the fence line as though they knew something had shifted in the order of things. They pressed their great dark heads against the posts and breathed their steam into the October air, and she stood between the fresh mound of earth and the restless herd, and understood that grief and work were not going to take turns with her. They would arrive together. She would have to carry both at once. She had come to the Callahan Ranch at 19 as a bride, full of the practical confidence that girls of her county carried into marriage the way they carried their mother's recipes, as something inherited and expected and not yet tested. She had been 21 when she understood that the ranch would not keep itself, and that Patrick Callahan, who was kind and funny, and absolutely certain about horses and weather, and entirely wrong about both at least half the time, was not going to be the kind of man who turned land into prosperity through careful management. He was the kind of man who turned land into a life worth living, which was a different and in many ways more important thing, and she had made her peace with the distinction years ago. Now she was 31 and the only adult left on the property, with 240 head of cattle that needed to reach the stockyards at Fort Calhoun before the first hard freeze, 3 cowhands whose confidence in her she could not yet measure, and a mortgage note held by a bank in Cheyenne whose agent had already sent 2 letters in as many months asking for a timeline. Patrick had not been a careful man with money. He had been a generous man, a man who paid more than he needed to for feed when the supplier was having a hard season, a man who lent tools and did not always get them back and did not always ask. These were the qualities she had loved in him. They were also laid end to end and counted in dollars. The reason the debt was what it was, there was no question of a different life, a smaller life, a retreat to her mother's house in Laramie, or a position in town. The ranch was hers. Patrick's debt was hers. The herd was hers. The question was simply whether she could get 240 head of cattle, 230 miles to Fort Calhoun, with 3 cowhands, a borrowed chuck wagon, and no trail boss. Before the grass gave out, and the cold came down from the north the way it always did in this part of Wyoming, without any kind of announcement or mercy, she went inside and made coffee. She looked at the calendar on the wall and she counted the days, moving her fingers slowly from square to square, working backward from the last possible departure date and forward from the first likely freeze. The window was tight. She drank her coffee standing up, because the table still held Patrick's coffee cup from the morning before he took sick, and she was not ready to move it. Then she braided her dark hair, put on Patrick's old hat because hers had blown into the creek 3 weeks ago, and she hadn't had a reason to replace it, and went out to speak to the cowhands. She found them in the equipment shed, not working, which told her everything she needed to know about how the last weeks had gone, and how the next ones might go if she did not set the terms clearly and immediately. Billy Morse was 17, hired on the previous spring, and had the particular combination of eagerness and incompetence that characterized boys who had grown up reading about cattle work rather than doing it. He was willing and not without talent, and he learned when corrected, which put him ahead of several men twice his age she had known. Santos Cruz was 22 and had done 1 drive for a rancher in Colorado who had sent him home before the end, and Santos had never explained why, which she thought was probably the honest answer to why. He was good on horseback and better with rope than he knew, and he had a steadiness to him that she valued. The third man was Pete Garrow, and Pete Garrow was the problem, not because he was difficult, but because he was experienced, and experienced men sometimes mistook experience for authority, and she needed to be very clear about who held authority before they went anywhere. Pete was 56 and had been on more drives than he could count, and had the bad knee and weathered face to prove it. He was not an unkind man, and he was not a dishonest man. He looked at Nora across the corral fence in the flat October light and said what the other 2 were thinking and did not have the nerve to say. "No outfit running a shared drive is going to let you on, Mrs. Callahan. Not with a woman in lead position. I've asked around." "I'm not planning to join a shared drive," she said. "We're going alone." He looked at the pen of cattle. He looked at Billy Morse and Santos Cruz, who were both studying the fence posts with great interest. He looked back at Nora. 3 riders and 240 head, he said. 4 riders, she said. "I'll ride with you." He was quiet for a moment. His expression held something that was not contempt and not pity, and was somewhere between the 2. which was perhaps the most maddening expression a person could offer someone in her position. "I've got more time on a drive than you," he said. "You have," she said. "And I know this range better than anyone alive. We leave Monday at first light. I'll need to know by end of day whether you're coming." She went back inside before he could reply, because she had said what needed to be said, and adding more words would only dilute it. She sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, and she wrote down everything that could go wrong. It was a long list, and she wrote it out carefully and methodically, because Patrick had always said that fear named was fear half beaten, and it was one of the few pieces of his philosophy that she had found consistently true. River crossing at Larkspur if the rain continued. The north flank if the Brennan ranchers ran their own cattle too close to the track. Weather. Always weather. A steer with a bad leg she'd noticed that morning. Billy Morse's inexperience on the flank. Pete Garrow's knee. Santos Cruz's one failed drive, and whatever had caused it. She wrote it all down. Then she made another list, which was everything she had. 12 years on this land. Every draw and bench and crossing between here and Fort Calhoun. A good eye for weather that her father had given her and the land had refined. And the cattle themselves, Patrick's cattle, the herd he had spent 14 years building on ground he loved. And she was going to take them home to the only market that mattered. She did not sleep much that weekend. She mended leather and oiled the traces and inventoried the supplies, and counted them again. She visited the steer with the bad leg and determined that he would make the distance if they kept the pace reasonable. And she watched him move, and she thought about Patrick, who had bought that particular steer at auction in the summer, while arguing that the animal had character, and she had laughed at him. And now the animal was going to have to prove Patrick right after Patrick was no longer there to be right about anything. By Sunday evening she had done everything she could do, and she sat on the porch in the cooling air with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and watched the light leave the hills to the west, the long level light that turned the sage silver and the fence posts gold before it went entirely. It was a beautiful country. It had always been a beautiful country. She had learned to see it the way Patrick saw it, which was the way someone saw a thing they loved without quite knowing they were going to love it until they were already lost to it. And she was glad, even now, even carrying the weight she was carrying, that she had come here at 19. It was during that quiet that the rider came. He came from the north, which was strange, because the north road led only to the Resting Cross Range, and the Resting Cross had been abandoned for 2 years, ever since its owner had died of a fever in Denver while his estate lawyers argued over the property, in the way estate lawyers argued over things, with great thoroughness and at considerable cost to the estate. The rider came at an unhurried trot, a big man on a dark horse, and he stopped at the gate without announcing himself, and looked at the house and the equipment shed, and the pens and the herd, with the kind of systematic, deliberate attention that was not nosiness but assessment, the look of someone taking inventory of a situation they were about to enter. Nora set her cup down on the porch railing and stood. She did not go for the rifle propped inside the door, because the man's hands were loose on the reins, and his posture was the posture of someone who expected to be received rather than refused. That was either the mark of a gentleman or an extremely confident fool, and in her experience those categories overlapped more than either group would have liked to admit. "Looking for Mrs. Callahan," he said. He had a low, level voice, unhurried as his horse, with no particular region in it. Some men sounded that way after they had spent long enough moving from place to place, as though they had worn the origin smooth. "You've found her." He looked at her for a moment, and whatever he was measuring, he appeared to arrive at a conclusion because he dismounted. She respected that. Men who conducted conversations with women from horseback were a particular type she had no patience for, and she had been prepared to be brief with him. "James Holt," he said. He held his hat and did not put it back on, which was a different kind of mark. "I've taken a 12-month lease on the Resting Cross, with an option to purchase." He paused, looking at the cattle in the pens. "I heard in town that you were without a trail boss for the Fort Calhoun drive." "Who told you that?" "Amos Draper at the feed store." He wasn't gossiping. He mentioned it as a practical matter. He said every experienced hand in the valley was either already committed or waiting to see how your drive turned out before they signed on anywhere for the fall season. She absorbed this. Amos Draper was not a malicious man, but he was a thorough man, and what he had said to this stranger was true, which was worse than if it had been invented. "I don't need a trail boss," she said. "I have 200 head of my own that need to reach Fort Calhoun before the first freeze," he said. 440 head move considerably better than 240. The stockyard split at the end is clean. I have no interest in your cut, and I'd have no claim on your herd's proceeds. He stopped, as though sorting through what to say next and choosing what was most useful. "I need a local person who knows this range. I'd provide 3 experienced riders. In return, I trail boss the merged drive." Another pause, and this one had more weight in it. "I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Callahan. I'm proposing an arrangement that solves a problem on both sides." She was quiet for a longer moment than was comfortable, but she was not the kind of woman who hurried toward a decision because silence felt awkward. "You'd trail boss," she said. "I would." "Under whose authority at final decision?" He considered this. The pause was not evasion. It was the pause of someone doing an honest accounting and arriving at an honest answer. "Yours," he said. "It's your range and your local knowledge. I'd run the riders day to day, but any material decision about the herd or the route, that comes to you." She looked at him. He met her gaze without challenge, and without the particular performance of deference that men sometimes offered women when they wanted something and thought performing deference was the fastest route to it. He just looked at her. It was, she thought, the look of someone accustomed to being taken at face value, or not at all, and comfortable with either outcome. She looked at the cattle in the pen, and at the hills behind them, and at the loaded chuck wagon that Pete Garrow had helped her pack 2 days ago, with exactly the supplies for 4 riders and 240 head. And she thought about the mortgage note, and she thought about Patrick, and she thought about what it meant to be the kind of woman who turned down practical help out of pride, which was a kind of pride she had no particular use for. "Come inside," she said. "We'll talk terms." His 3 riders arrived the next morning as arranged, and Nora assessed them the way she assessed anyone new to her land, which was quietly and without announcing her conclusions. Cora Vasquez was perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back under a plain hat, and a way of handling horses that was so efficient it was almost invisible, the movements of someone for whom the work had become entirely instinctive. She acknowledged Nora with a nod that contained within it a complete appraisal, and Nora received it in the same spirit, and decided she liked her immediately, which was not always a reliable instinct, but in this case felt sound. The Lynn brothers, Anders and Tom, were a year or 2 apart in age, and so similar in appearance and manner, that it was initially difficult to tell which was which. They were quiet and competent, and treated Nora with a particular careful respect that told her James Holt had spoken to them before they arrived, had told them something about her situation, and about what he expected from them on this drive, and that they had listened. She was grateful for that without making too much of it. The drive left Monday at first light. The merged herd, 443 head by the morning count, moved out of the pens and onto the trail in the slow, companionable way that large herds moved when they were not yet nervous. A sound like the earth shifting, a weight of movement that was almost tidal. Nora rode the right flank with Billy Morse, who needed the most supervision of the 3, and she watched him work and corrected him when it was necessary, and let him alone when it was not, which was how Patrick had taught her, and how she had learned, and how she believed most learning actually happened, in the space between instruction and independent effort. James Holt rode point with Cora Vasquez, and when the terrain permitted and the herd was settled, Nora watched him from across the moving mass of cattle with the patient, specific attention she gave to anything she needed to understand. He communicated with the riders through gestures and position, not voice, which was the right instinct for a big herd on a narrow track, where shouting spooked the cattle and subtlety moved them more reliably. He read the terrain ahead with the forward focus of a man who was genuinely looking, not performing the act of looking. He was good. That was the simplest thing she could say about it. It was the most accurate. He was good at this in the way that people were good at things when the knowing had moved from deliberate thought into muscle memory, when years of doing a thing had loaded it into the body, until the body simply did it without asking the mind. She had seen it in the best cattlemen and in her own father, and she recognized it clearly enough to trust it, which was the most important thing. The first 3 days were what drives should be when everything was going right, which was to say exhausting and repetitive and broadly uneventful. The grass held, the weather held, and the merged herd settled into its combined rhythm more quickly than she had expected, the cattle sorting themselves into something like social agreement about pace and position. Billy Morse was improving daily, which she attributed partly to his own effort, and partly to the fact that Anders Lind was riding near enough to give him wordless demonstrations, without ever putting himself forward as an instructor, which was a courtesy she noted and appreciated. Pete Garrow's knee was holding, though she caught him wincing in the saddle on the second afternoon, and she rode alongside him and asked him directly, because she had no patience for suffering that could be managed if acknowledged. "It'll hold," he said. "Why, tell me if it doesn't," she said. "I'd rather know." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and meant it. And it was the first time in 14 years that Pete Garrow had said ma'am to her and meant it, and she rode away before the expression on her face could be misread. The evenings were the working hours of the drive that she had always liked best. The settling of the herd, the gathering around the fire, the particular camaraderie of people who had spent a hard day doing the same hard thing and were now resting inside the shared knowledge of it. Cora proved to be a better cook than any of the 3 cowhands, which Nora suspected she had deliberately concealed during her initial introduction, and she produced biscuits on the second night that caused Tom Lynn to go silent, in a way that indicated deep personal feeling. James Holt ate without fanfare and listened more than he talked, which Nora observed was his consistent mode across most situations. He entered conversations when he had something relevant to contribute and exited them cleanly, without the trailing discourse that some men engaged in as though they were afraid of what would exist in the space after their voice stopped. On the 4th day the weather changed. She saw it first in the cattle, a collective unease moving through the herd from back to front, a shifting and shouldering, the low complaint of animals that had read something in the air that the humans hadn't registered yet. She looked north and saw the light was wrong, a flat yellow quality to the sky above the hills. That was not the yellow of late afternoon, but the yellow of a particular kind of weather system building pressure behind a ridgeline. She was writing to James before she had consciously decided to, and he was already looking north when she pulled up beside him. "Weather," she said. "Coming fast," he said. "There's a draw about 3 miles east. I saw it on the survey map. Good shelter, natural walls on 3 sides. The draw floods," she said. He looked at her. "Not in every storm," she said, "but in a northwest system, which is what this is. The creek behind the eastern ridge backs up against its own banks. It's slow in the channel because the channel bends north just past the draw. I've seen it flood twice in 8 years." She was already reading the sky again. "If we put 440 head into that draw tonight in a northwest storm, we put them in 4 feet of water before midnight." The wind picked up as she was speaking, a cold leading edge, the kind of wind that felt like a door opening in the sky. "What do you have?" he said. "There's a flat bench above the old Crenshaw homestead, about the same distance but north instead of east. Higher ground, natural windbreak on the western face." She had been on that bench twice in dry weather and once in rain, helping Patrick retrieve a steer that had wandered. She knew the terrain the way she knew everything on this range, with her body as much as her mind. He looked at the sky for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Let's move," he said. She did not wait to be asked twice. She called to Santos and the Lynn brothers and signaled Pete Garrow at the rear, and they turned the herd, which was already showing its nerves in the mincing sidestep of cattle that feel weather and don't know what to do about it. Turning a nervous herd in a new direction without triggering a run required the kind of coordinated patience that looked effortless from the outside and required total attention from everyone inside it. And for the next 30 minutes, that was all there was. The work of moving 440 animals that did not want to be moved in a direction they had not anticipated. They made the bench, not comfortably, and not without difficulty, and by the end Nora's arms ached from the constant subtle pressure on the reins, and her voice was raw from the few commands she'd had to use when gesture wasn't sufficient. The cattle pressed into the windbreak and quieted almost immediately, which told her the shelter was right, and the horses were picketed, and the camp was secured in the last minutes before the storm came down. It came hard, rain and sleet together, driven sideways by the northwest wind, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the first hour and kept going. They put up what canvas they had, and kept the fire barely alive under a piece of tin propped against the chuck wagon, and they sat in the least wet positions available and waited for it to pass. Nora sat under the overhang of the wagon bed with her knees drawn up and listened to the herd standing solid in the windbreak, and felt the long, specific satisfaction of a correct decision made at the right moment, which was a satisfaction unlike most others because it required the full prior awareness of how wrong the wrong decision would have been. James Holt came and sat at the edge of the overhang. He shook the water off his hat and held his hands toward the small fire, and did not speak for a while. "You've been on enough drives that you knew that draw," he said finally. It was not a question. "I've been on this land for 12 years, she said. "I've been on one drive, badly, as a girl helping my father. I know this range. I don't know drives the way you know them." She said it plainly, without apology, and without false modesty, because that was how she said things. "I was going to go alone with 3 riders and figure out the parts I didn't know as we went. You would have been in 4 feet of water in a draw tonight." "Possibly," she said. "Or I would have read the same weather read you did and remembered the bench before you suggested the draw." He was quiet for a moment. The rain came in sheets against the canvas. "Yes," he said. "Possibly." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire with a steady, unrevealing expression, and the scar along his jaw caught the low light. A thin white line from his ear to his chin, old enough to be a story he no longer told to explain it. "What did you do before cattle?" she asked. The pause was not evasive. It was long in the way that some silences were long because they contained more than one answer and the person was deciding which answer was the honest one. "Law," he said. "For some years. Then some other things that were related to law in ways that are complicated to explain." She thought about this. She looked at the scar and did not mention it, because it was not hers to mention. "My husband died 7 weeks ago," she said. Not because the information was necessary, but because she was tired of the unspoken presence of it in every conversation she had been having for 7 weeks. The thing everyone knew and no one said, the omission around which every exchange had to navigate. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "Amos Draper." "Yes, what else did Amos tell you?" He was quiet for a moment. "That your husband was well liked, and that you were the most capable person on the range, and that most of the men in the valley were quietly hoping you'd have trouble on this drive, because the alternative was admitting that had been true for a long time." She sat with that for a moment. The wind found a gap in the canvas and shivered it. "Is that why you came to the gate?" she said. "I came because I have 200 head that need moving," he said. "The rest of it factored in the way most things factor when you're making a decision. You don't usually make a decision for one reason." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. He did not look away and he did not lean in, and she understood something in that moment that she filed away for later, which was that this was a man who knew how to hold a moment still without pushing it toward a conclusion it hadn't earned. "Do you have family?" she said. "Somewhere." "No," he said. "Not for some years." He looked at the fire. "I've been moving from one thing to the next for a long time. The Resting Cross lease is the first time I've looked at a piece of land and thought I might stay." "Why that land?" "The hills run right," he said. "And the water is where it should be. And the people in the valley, what I've seen of them, seem like the kind of people who matter." She thought about Patrick, who had said something almost exactly like that on the day she had arrived at this ranch for the first time, who had stood at the porch railing and waved his arm at the hills and said, "Look how the hills run, Nora." And she had looked and she had seen it and she had been lost to it from that moment. Some pieces of country simply called to certain people. It was not mystical. It was just true. The storm passed in the small hours, as storms in that country often did, suddenly and without apology, leaving behind a sky rinsed clean in a cold that crystallized the last wet grass into something that glittered in the early light. The herd was intact. The cattle were calm. with the residual quiet of animals that had been frightened and then sheltered, and were now profoundly comfortable by contrast. They moved them out at dawn. Pete Garrow, who had ridden down to the draw in the early morning to check it, reported back that the flood had reached the fence posts, which were the tallest fixed objects in the draw, and thus the appropriate measure. He said it without editorial comment, which was its own kind of comment. The middle days of the drive were the long ordinariness of the work, which was not uninteresting but which required a different kind of attention than the dramatic moments. A sustained, quiet watchfulness that was in some ways harder to maintain. Nora rode the right flank and managed Billy Morse, and kept her eye on the steer with the bad leg, who was moving better than she'd feared. She and Santos Cruz traded the left flank when the terrain required it, and she watched him work and decided that whatever had gone wrong on his Colorado drive was not a failure of ability, because his ability was plain, and was probably a failure of something else, a wrong outfit or a wrong man above him, which happened often enough. Cora Vasquez turned out to be the single best rider on the drive, which Nora recognized before the end of the first week, and mentioned to James Holt on the 8th evening, when Cora had turned a breaking steer with a rope loop and a horse that appeared to read her mind. "I know," he said. "She's better than me, better than most people I've worked with." "Then why does she ride for you?" Nora said. "Fair wages and no stupidity," he said. "She's had both short." Nora thought about this. She filed it alongside the other things she was accumulating about this man. The quiet ones. The things he said and didn't say. The things he did that she suspected he did the same way, whether anyone was watching or not. On the 10th day, Pete Garrow's knee gave out badly enough that he spent a day and a half in the chuck wagon, which left 5 active riders for 443 head on terrain that narrowed through a passage she had known would be difficult. They managed it by working longer hours and sleeping less, and by Santos Cruz finding a resource of energy and skill that she was reasonably certain he had not known he possessed, because the look on his face at the end of that day was the look of someone who had discovered something about himself and was still deciding how to feel about it. She was the last one awake on most nights. She had not slept well since Patrick died, which was the shape grief took with her, entering through the nighttime hours, when there was nothing to do but feel it, and leaving during the days when there was always something to do instead. She sat by the low fire after the others were down, and she let herself think about the numbers, which was partly calculation and partly the way she managed the fear about the numbers, by converting it into arithmetic, which had right answers. The herd was in good condition. The weather had cooperated since the first storm. The steer with the bad leg was making it. If the price held to the contracted rate, and the weight was within the expected range, the sale would cover the mortgage note with perhaps $200 remaining, which was not comfort, but was survival, which was what she was asking for. James Holt found her on the 12th night, when they were 2 days out from Fort Calhoun. He came and sat across the fire from her with a cup of coffee, and did not speak immediately, which she had come to understand was simply how he approached things that mattered to him. He gave them the preliminary silence of someone who wanted to say the right thing rather than the first thing. "You're not sleeping," he said. "Neither are you." "I sleep poorly in unfamiliar country." He turned the cup in his hands. "I've been doing it long enough that it's less insomnia and more habit." She looked at the fire. The coals were orange and deep. "I don't sleep because I haven't yet calculated whether this drive is enough," she said. "Whether the note gets paid, and whether what's left is enough to make it through the winter and start the spring gather. Whether I can run the place alone, or whether I'll have to take on more debt to hire enough." She stopped. "I don't know why I said that." "Because it's the middle of the night and it's been sitting in you for 2 weeks, he said. "Sometimes things need to come out just to stop pressing on you from the inside." It was not a sentimental observation. It was practical, like most of the things he said, and she received it as such. "Do you have somewhere you're going after Fort Calhoun?" she said. "Back to the resting cross," he said. "I have 12 months to decide whether I'm staying." He looked at the fire. "The land wants working. It's been sitting empty for 2 years, and it needs attention. That kind of work suits me at the moment." "What kind of work suits someone," she said, "who used to practice law?" He smiled briefly. the first time she had seen him smile. And it changed his face in a way that was hard to look at directly, not because it was unpleasant, but because it was unexpectedly genuine, the smile of a person who did not use smiling as a social mechanism, and whose smiles therefore meant something. Less work with other people's words, he said. More work with my hands. After a long time of the first kind, the second one is what I wanted. She looked at him across the fire. The scar was a line of silver in the low light. The country lay dark and enormous around them, the stars very bright the way they were bright in open country, without towns nearby to dim them, and the herd breathed and shifted in the dark, and the horses stood quiet on their picket lines. "I'm not sorry you came to my gate," she said. It was a precise statement. She had chosen it carefully, and she let it sit without adding to it. He looked at her for a moment. "Neither am I," he said. They sat by the fire for another half hour, not talking much, comfortable in the way two people were comfortable who had been working hard in close proximity for nearly 2 weeks, and had developed, through the accumulating evidence of each other's work and judgment and response to difficulty, something that was not quite friendship yet, and was not quite anything else, something that was still in the process of becoming its name. She slept that night, not long and not dreamlessly, but she slept. They came into Fort Calhoun late on the 14th day. The herd moved down the main approach track in a long, slow river. 440 heads of cattle with their peculiar collective music, the low sound of that many animals moving together, and the town turned to watch in the way that Fort Calhoun always watched drives arrive, with the practiced detachment of a place that had seen many of them, and reserved its enthusiasm for the spending that followed. Nora rode at the front as the count began. She had known the numbers since morning, but she listened to the weighmaster's count with the specific attention she gave to numbers that determined things. When the weighmaster called out 242, she did the arithmetic one more time in her head, and the arithmetic was still what it had been, and she allowed herself a single breath of something that was not quite relief yet. The buyer waiting to receive the Callahan portion of the herd was a man named Everett Tull. She had known who he would be before they arrived, because Patrick had contracted with him in August, and she had done what she always did with information about a person she was going to need to deal with, which was to ask everyone she knew what they thought of him. The consensus was that Everett Tull was a man who had built a successful business on the principle that sellers in desperate situations had reduced negotiating power, and that he was skilled at identifying and creating situations of exactly that kind. He came out of the stockyards office when the herd was finishing its count, a man of about 50 with a good coat and the careful grooming of someone who wanted to be taken for a gentleman and had learned to approximate it through attention to surface details. He looked at the herd and at the riders, and then he looked at Nora, and his face made an adjustment that she recognized, the adjustment of someone recalibrating their initial estimate of a situation. "Oh, Mrs. Callahan," he said. His voice had a warmth in it that was not warmth. "I heard about your husband, such a terrible loss. I hope the drive wasn't too great an ordeal under the circumstances." "The drive went well," she said. "I imagine you'll be relieved to have it finished. Such a demanding undertaking for—" He paused, and the pause was the intended insult, and she did not take it. "For any operator," he finished, and the finish was worse than the pause. "I'd like to proceed to the contract," she said. "The price my husband agreed with you in August." His expression shifted very slightly, the way a card player's expression shifted when the hand was not what they'd anticipated. "Mrs. Callahan, I want to be sensitive to your situation," he said. "Market conditions have moved since August. The price I offered Mr. Callahan was based on assumptions about the fall market that haven't entirely." "The contract is in writing," Nora said. She took the folded document from the inside pocket of her coat. She had put it there that morning, the only pocket she was entirely certain was secure, and she unfolded it now and held it out to him. She did not extend her arm fully, because he would have to come to her to take it, and he did. He read it. She watched him read it. The weighmaster was completing his count on the other side of the pen, and the numbers were going into the ledger. "The market," Tull began again. "The contract specifies 240 head minimum, delivered to Fort Calhoun stockyards before the first freeze of the season," she said. She did not raise her voice, and she did not alter its cadence. The weighmaster is counting 242 head. The first freeze has not yet come. I've fulfilled the terms. She was aware of James Holt standing perhaps 10 feet to her left. She did not look at him because she did not need to look at him. But she was aware of him the way she was aware of solid ground underfoot, as a fact that did not require constant confirmation. She was also aware that he was giving Everett Tull absolutely nothing. No expression, no posture, no gesture that Tull could read and use. He was simply standing there, still, present without force, letting the moment belong entirely to her. She had not asked him to do that. He had simply done it. Everett Tull looked at the contract again. He looked at the cattle. He looked at her. He was running, she understood, the same calculation she had run for 2 weeks on this drive. But his arithmetic was different from hers. His arithmetic was about reputations and future contracts, and what it would cost him to contest a written agreement from a widow in a stockyards full of witnesses who would remember it. He paid the contracted price. She stood at the window while the amount was entered into the ledger, and she did the arithmetic in her head for the last time. And the arithmetic was still enough, the same enough it had been since this morning, since last night, since she had first run it in the kitchen 3 weeks ago, and found its lower limit. It was the lower limit. It was the minimum possible version of enough. But enough was enough, which was a sentence Patrick would have turned into a philosophy, and she was content to let it be only arithmetic. She paid the writers first, cash from the envelope she'd brought for the purpose, and she shook each hand and meant it. Billy Morse stood up straighter when she shook his than he had stood since she'd hired him. Santos Cruz nodded at her with something in his face that she thought he would need a day or two to identify for himself. Pete Garrow said, "Good drive, Mrs. Callahan," in the tone he used for things he meant entirely, and she said, "It was," and they both meant it. James Holt found her when the writers had scattered into the town to spend their wages, and spend their relief at the difficulty being behind them. He fell into step beside her on the main street of Fort Calhoun, which was a town she had been to 4 times before, and which looked the same as every time. A hardware store, a hotel, a saloon, a church, a dry goods establishment, and the general air of a place that expected more from the country than the country had yet delivered. "Enough," she said, before he could ask. "Good," he said. They walked a short distance. The street was not empty, but it was not full. The afternoon light long and cold on the false fronts of the buildings. "The resting cross's north boundary meets your east fence line about a mile above the creek crossing," he said. It was offered as a fact, not as a beginning, or perhaps as a fact that was also a beginning, and they were both aware of which it was. "I know where my fence lines are," she said. "Neighboring land," he said. "About an hour's ride between the houses." "I know that too." The wind came down the street, and she caught her hat, Patrick's hat, which she had been wearing for 3 weeks now, and which had become simply her hat somewhere in the middle of the drive. And she did not examine the moment of that transition too closely, because some transitions happened most cleanly when you did not watch them. "The Valley families hold a supper at the Whitmore place," she said. "First Saturday of November. It would be a reasonable occasion for a new leaseholder on the resting cross to introduce himself." He was quiet for a moment. "First Saturday of November," he said. "The Whitmores set a good table," she said. "And it would give you a chance to meet the people whose land adjoins yours." "That sounds like a practical reason to attend," he said. "Yes," she said. "It does." They stopped at the corner where the main street met the road to the stockyards, and the late afternoon light made long shadows of them both on the dusty ground, and Nora looked at her shadow and at his, and at the shadows of the buildings all around them, the world reduced to its simplest forms by the angle of the light. 14 days, she said. "Yes, 230 miles. 232 by my measure," he said. "The detour around the Brennan Draw cost 1.5 miles. She looked at him. The corners of his eyes held the particular fine lines of someone who had spent a great deal of time squinting into distance, and the scar along his jaw was simply a scar, the record of something that had happened in what were apparently complicated years, and the eyes themselves were the steady, careful eyes she had been reading for 2 weeks and had found consistently honest. "First Saturday of November," she said. "I'll be there," he said. She went to find the wagon that would take her home. The drive back was 3 days. The herd left at Fort Calhoun in the hands of the buyer, and the riders dispersed to their own directions. Nora drove the wagon herself with Pete Garrow's leg elevated on a flour sack beside her, and Billy Morse asleep in the wagon bed, and Santos Cruz riding alongside on his horse. And the country opened wide around them with the particular spaciousness of country you knew, the same ground you had crossed in the other direction but now familiar. Now on the homeward side, Pete Garrow talked more on the drive back than he had talked the entire drive out, which he attributed to the combination of relief and the fact that his leg was better, and he could afford the luxury of speech. He talked about drives he had done, and drives he had heard about, and about a horse he had owned 30 years ago, that he described with a reverence she recognized as the reverence people reserve for things that had been entirely excellent. She listened and let him talk, and the miles went quietly behind them. She thought about Patrick a great deal on those 3 days of homeward travel, more freely than she had allowed herself during the drive out, when thinking about him had felt like a kind of distraction she couldn't afford. Now she could afford it. She thought about the way he had looked at the ranch the day they arrived, the proprietary pride of a man who had not yet done anything to earn the land but was already certain he would. She thought about the morning he had bought the steer with the bad leg at auction, genuinely convinced the animal had character. And she thought about that same steer making every mile of 232, because Patrick had been right about him. She thought about the coffee cup on the windowsill and what she would do with it eventually, whether she would put it away or keep it there where the light hit it in the mornings. And she decided she would keep it there a while longer because some decisions did not need to be made until they made themselves. On the second evening, when the camp was settled and Santos Cruz had made the coffee, and Billy Morse was writing something in a little notebook he kept that Nora had never asked about, Pete Garrow sat across the fire from her and looked at his coffee cup for a while. "That man knows what he's doing," he said. She did not ask which man, because there was only one he could mean. "He does," she said. "Good of him to step back at the stockyards," Pete said. "Some men wouldn't." "No," she said. "They wouldn't." They drank their coffee and the fire burned down, and the stars came out, and she sat for a while after the others were asleep. Not because she couldn't sleep, but because she wanted to hold the quiet for a few minutes before she returned to everything waiting at the ranch, the work that didn't stop because she had been away, the accounts, the decisions about the winter feed, the assessment of what the next season would need to be, and whether she could build it. She thought about Patrick, who would have narrated the drive with enthusiasm and embellishment, and who would have taken credit for the weather read at the Crenshaw bench in a way that would have made her laugh. She thought about him without the acute pain that had accompanied every thought of him for the first weeks, and she understood that the acute pain was not gone, but that she had begun, without deciding to, the work of carrying it differently, not setting it down, just redistributing it so that it did not make all the other carrying impossible. She came home on a Friday evening just as the light was going. The approach to the ranch from the east was the approach she had always loved best. The way the house appeared first as a dark shape against the hills, and then became itself, became the particular house she lived in, with its porch and its kitchen window, and the old cottonwood that Patrick had planted the year they arrived, and which was now large enough to shade the south wall in summer. She had not let herself look forward to it during the drive, because looking forward to things was a way of making the distance feel longer than it was. But now she let herself look, and the looking was good. The ranch stood as she had left it, the house and the pens and the fence line, the hills bare above it now, October well along toward November. She unhitched the horses and watered them and checked the remaining stock, and walked the fence line by the last light of day, and found it sound, which it had been when she left, and she had not doubted it, but she checked it anyway because that was what you did. You checked the things that mattered. Then she went inside and lit the lamp and put the kettle on and set the mortgage receipt and the bank's paid-in-full acknowledgment on the kitchen table, and she stood and looked at them for a long moment, just looked. Patrick's coffee cup was still on the table. She had moved it finally to the windowsill 2 days before they left, where the morning light hit it, and it was still there, a simple brown cup, and she left it where it was. She sat down and drank her tea. The lamp made its small circle of warmth against the night. Somewhere outside a fence post settled with the cold, the small sounds of a ranch at rest. The cattle were in the pens and the note was paid, and the land was hers, and tomorrow the work would start again, and she was ready for it, which was the truth she had arrived at on the far side of 232 miles, and 14 days, and one storm, and one buyer who had looked at her and seen someone who could be moved, and had been wrong. On the first Saturday of November, the Whitmore place was lit up against the early dark, the sound of a fiddle carrying through the cold air, and the wagon tracks in the road were frozen at the edges, and the grass in the fields was the silver white of early frost. Nora came in the wagon Pete Garrow had lent her, which was newer than hers, and rode better, and she tied up at the rail among the other horses and wagons and went inside. The Whitmore house was warm and smelled of roasting meat and wood smoke, and the particular social warmth of a gathering of people who knew each other well and were glad to be together at the end of a hard season. Mrs. Whitmore embraced her, and 3 other women came to speak to her, and she moved through the room with the equanimity she had learned to maintain in public, receiving the regard of her neighbors, their concern, and their respect, and the particular quality of attention that communities gave to women who had done difficult things without performing either gratitude or bravado. Amos Draper shook her hand and held it for a moment and said, "Good drive, Mrs. Callahan," in the same tone Pete Garrow had used, the tone of someone who knew what it had cost and wanted that knowledge acknowledged without making a speech about it. And she said, "Good drive, Amos," and meant it. She did not look for him when she entered. She did not need to. She could feel when he came into a room. She had learned that about herself on the drive. The way she was aware of the specific quality of his attention, in the same way she was aware of a change in weather, not through any particular sensation but through a shift in the texture of the surrounding air. He was near the window speaking to Amos Draper about something she couldn't hear, and he looked up when she came into the room. The look was brief. It was unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it contained, and it contained a great deal, the accumulated acknowledgement of 2 weeks of hard work done alongside each other. The Crenshaw bench and the storm, and the fire at midnight, and Everett Tull's face when he paid the contracted price. And underneath all of that, the possibility of what came next, held carefully, at a pace that was right. She did not cross to him immediately. She spoke to her neighbors, and she ate the food Mrs. Whitmore put in front of her, and she listened to the fiddle, which was being played by the youngest Kendrick boy, who was 14 and had more talent than years. Later, when the evening had settled into its own rhythm and people had eaten and the conversation had become the comfortable rambling of people who had known each other through many seasons, he came and stood beside her at the window. Outside, the country lay under the deep dark of a clear November night, the stars brilliant and cold, the hills only a deeper darkness against the darkness of the sky. "How is the resting cross?" she said. "The fences need work," he said. "The east pasture is in better shape than I expected. I found a spring above the upper meadow that isn't on any survey map." "I know that spring," she said. "Patrick found it 12 years ago. He never told anyone because he thought they'd try to claim access." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll mark it on my map," he said, "and put a fence around it so the cattle don't foul it." "That's the right thing to do," she said. The fiddle moved into something slow. A few couples had made their way to the cleared center of the room. Nora watched them without any particular feeling except the mild, warm feeling of familiar people doing a familiar thing in a warm room, while outside the world was cold and dark and full of work waiting for morning. "The spring gather begins in April," she said. "On my range, I'll need 2 experienced hands for 2 weeks at minimum." "The resting cross will be ready by April," he said, "with good hands." "Neighboring land," she said. "Neighborly thing to help." "Very neighborly," he said. She looked at him. He was looking out the window at the dark hills, and the light from inside caught his profile, the steady line of jaw and brow, and the scar that was simply part of his face now in her understanding of it. He turned and looked at her, and the look was quiet and patient, and held the same thing it had held across the fire at midnight 2 weeks ago, something in the process of becoming its name, not hurried toward a conclusion it had not yet earned. "First Saturday of December," she said. "The Hendersons host. It's a larger gathering." "I'll be there," he said. She looked out at the dark hills of the country she loved, the hills that ran right, the hills that were hers, and she thought about what came next. which was not certain and was not meant to be. The country did not traffic in certainties, neither did the people it made. What came next was the next thing, approached at a walk, with the hard-won knowledge of one's own capacity, lodged in the hands and the body where earned knowledge always lived. She had driven them home, every one of them, across 232 miles of country and weather, and one buyer who had underestimated her and been wrong, and the land was hers, and the note was paid, and she was here in a warm room on the first Saturday of November with the fiddle playing and the hills outside and the particular, careful, unhurried thing between them that was still finding its name. It was enough. It was the beginning of enough. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.